everybody, this is Ashley. Welcome back to the All-to-New YouTube channel for another installment of Lovely Layering with Ashley. Today I am going to be creating a realistic looking flower, and if you're somebody who frequents the All-to-New YouTube channel, or has seen my series before, you may be thinking that you've seen a card very much like this, and that's true. I used the same stamp set and the same basic principles in a video before, but this time we're only going to be using markers, and I'm going to show you how to get those really realistic lines and that look and tone to your flowers. In my previous video that I did like this, I used colored pencils, but I realized that not everybody is very comfortable with adding two different mediums, so I wanted to give an example and give some tips on how you can use just your markers to create a very realistic look. The stamp set that I'll be using for my example today is the Grateful Heart stamp set, and I love this outline image for creating realistic flowers. In my opinion, to not have the pre-drawn detailed lines like these here in this example of the Everlasting Happiness stamp set, I think when you have a lack of detail inside the petals, it really allows your imagination to take over. And it's something that takes a lot of practice, sort of just coming up with your own design or the detail inside a flower. But if you keep going, you'll sort of get your niche and realize where you like to put the shadows and the highlights. And so that's something that I'll be showing you and sharing with you today. So I'm going to stamp this image in some alcohol marker friendly ink, which means that the alcohol in the markers won't make the ink run or smudge when I'm coloring. I'm going to be using the Red Cosmos line of alcohol markers today, and all of these individual numbers and color names are in the description if you're interested in that. It's important to keep everything organized when you're doing these colorings because you don't want to pick up the wrong color when you're looking for a highlight shade and you pick up a darker color. That can really ruin a coloring or an image that you've worked really hard on. So I like to make sure that all of my markers stay in order, and whichever order works for you is totally fine, but I like to keep mine from darkest to lightest from the left to the right. So you can see that with markers, I'm using this flicking motion, and that's going to be the name of the game for the entire coloring. I want to use this flicking motion because I want it to represent the different veins and the folds and the hills and valleys of each petal. You'll also notice when I'm coloring that I work on one petal at a time. So I don't jump around from petal to petal with my darkest color. I will do one entire petal with all four of my shades and then move on to the next and use all four of my shades, and so on and so forth. You can also see that I've created some lines at the very top of that petal, and that's going to create the look as if there are some folds in the tip of the petal. I've chosen the places to put these lines by simply just putting them where I saw any indentation in that line. Now, something else that you'll notice as I'm coloring is that I don't rush myself, and I will go back several times in this one petal to create more lines or to go back on a color that I think that I missed a little bit of. But mostly it's just to take my time and to make sure that I'm happy with it before I move on. That's not to say to abandon it all when you're not happy with it, because you'll see in just a minute that it doesn't always look amazing without it being all together. So I went ahead and took my second darkest color, or my second to darkest color, and created some blending by just going from the base of that darkest color and then moving up a little bit farther. And then from the top, I went from the base of that darkest color, but at the top, and then dragged it down even farther. I repeated that with my third to darkest color. And then my lightest shade is when I switch it up and go from the top, making flicks downward. I do this because I find that it adds a little bit more dimension. When you're flicking, you're doing a flicking motion, the base of wherever you've started to flick is going to be the thickest, whereas where you've ended your flick and picked up your marker, you're going to get a very thin pointed, tapered end there. And if I go from the top to the bottom on my lightest color, you'll really get some spots where there's not much saturation, and that's great for when you're trying to create really unique and realistic peaks and valleys of in the detail of a petal. So my final tip for doing each petal is to go in one more time with that darkest color and then just create that initial peak at the base of the petal. I do this because a lot of times in a flower, when you'll see it, it comes out from the base and there's usually some sort of pull in the center where it's attached to the flower. I just feel like this helps it look that much more realistic, and I end up taking my darkest shade, my shadow shade, and bringing up in the center to a very fine and much farther point than the rest of the base shadow, and that kind of creates that pinched look in the center. So I'm going through this petal a little bit quicker just so you can see that the basic principles are all the same. So there I'm going with my lightest shade again from the top down to the bottom rather than the bottom from the top. And I really like going in with my second to lightest shade and just adding a little bit more of those tapered lines from the top to the bottom just to add a little bit more of that dimension. So I'm going to go ahead and really speed this up now so that you can see my entire process, and I'll be back in just a minute when I start to color the center. Okay, so now that I have finished coloring all of my florals, I'm going to focus on the center of my flower, which can be very intimidating to make it look realistic. So I don't often try to make it look as realistic as I can. The general sort of technique or rule that I follow for myself is to start with a very light tone all over. So here I'm using a light yellow tone, and then come in with a darker tone at the base of the petals and go all the way around. So that will give it a look of being sort of like deeper where the petals are touching it. This particular flower has some stamens, I think they're called, coming up into the petal. So I'm going to take those sort of like buds of pollen and I'm coloring them in with a white gel pen. And this is really just to make them stand out. I've colored over them when I was coloring in my petals because it's really tough to color around them. They're pretty small. So just to make sure that they stand out and that you can see them and appreciate their detail, I'm going to color those in with a white gel pen. So here is the final card. You can see that the texture, the look of the texture that you get with that flicking motion just by using markers and nothing else really creates such an impact. I hope that you've enjoyed learning a little bit about how I like to create some realness in my flowers. As always, links to all of the products used today are in the description, as well as the link to my previous video if you are interested in learning some colored pencil tips as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. Thank you. Bye.